Welcome into the special edition of the Fast Lane. Trey Lau here with you, joined by Keenan Cummings from WestVirginiaSports.com, Rivals.com. We're here to talk the Black Diamond Trophy for the second time since 2008 or five, I should say. This game is being played, which is kind of weird to say. This was another rivalry for West Virginia that the ACC took from them. Obviously, the other one being the Backyard Brawl. But the Black Diamond Trophy is back in Morgantown as they play each other on Saturday. And let's dive right into it, starting with maybe the most fun side. I think this Virginia Tech defense under Justin Hamilton looked really good against Sam Howell, who's one of the top quarterbacks in the country, facing a Neil Brown offense and Jared Dagey that has shown signs of explosion, but the issue has always been the turnovers for them. It really hurt them against Maryland earlier this year. But what do you see in that matchup, Keenan, as we dive into it?
I think that there's two bulletin points that I would underline if you're West Virginia in this game. One is going to be how Jared Dagey responds to pressure. Jared Dagey's been a very good quarterback, when he has time to throw in the pocket, has time to scan and do that kind of thing. He struggled when teams have been able to heat him up. Sometimes not as much. It's not an every time thing, but against Maryland, you saw that. They were able to get pressure. They were able to get in the backfield, disrupt his rhythm, and the offense struggled for that. Last week, he looked amazing, but of course, how much pressure is Long Island going to be able to put on a Power 5 team? So he had a clean pocket. I think it was 94% of the time last week. So it's really hard to take anything from that. I think the ball kind of got rolling downhill against Maryland. You could tell he was a little bit of a confidence issue, I think. He spent all offseason trying to improve that part of his game, stepping up in the pocket, buying time, and being able to throw the football down the field. So I think that's one. And number two for West Virginia, depending on how Dagey does, obviously, if both of these things go negatively, it's going to be very hard for West Virginia to move the football. But they've got to be able to run the ball better than they did a week ago. I think that was, truthfully, to cut all the BS, I don't think they really cared. They knew they could beat Long Island without really scheming a run or anything. So I don't think that was an issue. I don't think you look at the numbers last week. I don't necessarily think you panic over that if you're West Virginia. But they did run the ball all right against Maryland. They're going to have to run the ball a lot better against Virginia Tech. They obviously have some weapons in the backfield. Letty Brown, the offensive line, was supposed to take a step forward. That remains to be seen. I think this is kind of a litmus test for West Virginia and Virginia Tech. What happens in this game is going to tell a lot, really, about both these teams moving forward.
And obviously, I don't want to say this is an emotional. It's a weirdly emotional game because this is a rivalry game. There's a lot of history in this game, but it's just not been played that often. Like, it's been played once since I've been in high school, and so it's definitely a weirdly emotional game. So before we dive into the other side of the ball a little bit more, how has West Virginia kind of tried to infuse that emotion that comes with these type of games? I know Virginia Tech has kind of harped on using older players on the coaching staff to kind of remind these players about the rivalry. Not a lot of these players played in the last time these two teams played. So how has that happened from the coaching staff this week?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting paradox in a sense. When you look at it from the fan perspective and player perspective. For fans, they don't need any incentive. You grew up a West Virginia fan, or if you grew up a Virginia Tech fan, you might not have been privy to this rivalry. Maybe the game in 2017, but your dad's told you about it. Your grandpa's told you about it. This was a very, very passionate, heated rivalry. And from the West Virginia perspective, still very much is from the fan base. It's a game that they definitely like to see play. And I think that getting it back on campus is a good thing too. Obviously, the neutral site game was fun, but this year, next year, having on-campus meetings, and who knows what happens in the future with conference realignment. But from a fan perspective, it's one thing. The players, as you were mentioning, entirely different. Neither of these players are going to look at this as a rivalry game. And let's just cut to it. They won't. Most of them, when they were being recruited, these teams weren't playing. There's not that type of passion there. And you mentioned former players for Virginia Tech. West Virginia's relied on Jeff Castile. Familiar name probably for Virginia Tech fans. Longtime defensive coordinator under Rich Rodriguez. He was kind of here when this rivalry was boiling over, in a sense. So he's talked to the players. Neil Brown has educated himself on the rivalry and really kind of drive home that, I know that it's a team on the schedule for you guys, and every game, the next game is always the most important if we want to speak coach speak. But for the fans, this is a very important game, and there's a lot of passion and a lot of intensity. Really, I mean, still with these fan bases to this day.
Yeah, you kind of touched on it. And just to put it in perspective, Tech's last win was 2004. They've played 3 times since then and hold the trophy for 6,000 days. Like, that's how long, like, that was the last time, like, that's how long that they're quote unquote holding the Black Diamond trophy's been. 2004 is a long time, but they've played 3 times since then. And obviously 05 and then 2017. Like, so, and then 04, obviously. So it just shows kind of the disparity of this rivalry. It's very similar to, obviously Pitt being the backyard brawl and that rivalry going away with ACC realignment, which if you listen, maybe West Virginia goes to the ACC, maybe not, given that the Big 12 just expanded to 4 more teams. Going back into the game, you touched on it, running the ball. I think that's a key for both teams, both offensively and defensively. Obviously, Virginia Tech, especially with the loss of James Mitchell, is going to be built on running the football. That's how they beat North Carolina. Offensively, they should have scored probably 2 more times at least with bad turnovers and a missed kick. And so how important is the line of scrimmage? I feel like, it's cliche, but Virginia Tech's strength is their lines offensively and defensively. And that's something where it's going to test West Virginia, who's shown improvement on the lines, but it's definitely going to be a challenge.
Fortunately for West Virginia, that's probably the strength of the defense, the front 7.
Absolutely.
I think for take everything I said about West Virginia running the football and maybe times it by 3 for Virginia Tech. They have to run the football. Yeah, barring West Virginia just turning the ball over 6 times, wacky stuff that happens, special teams. I think Tech's going to have to run the football. They do a good job using their quarterback, and that, as you very well know, in that regard, West Virginia's going to have to be there for that. I'm interested to see, with the loss of Mitchell, does it change anything for them? He's obviously a big threat, a security blanket, a guy that can do a lot of things. Obviously have some talented wide receivers on the outside, Trey Turner and some other guys. They kind of strike me as the offense right now that they trust Burmeister to kind of run the football, make some safe throws, and take a couple shots every now and then. For West Virginia's sake, that if they come in with that game plan, if they play a lot of 12 personnel, try to keep the ball on the ground, that does kind of play into what has been the strength so far. West Virginia's weakness this year, at least defensively, and it's a limited sample size. What I'm saying right now might not be true at the end of the year, but has been their cornerback play. Maryland blew the game open a little bit, was able to put some distance with some big plays, getting a young corner to bite. So it'll be interesting to me who controls the line of scrimmage on each side. I know it's cliche, you mentioned that, but I think it's paramount in this game with 2 teams that have quarterbacks that, while are threats in their own right, still have questions about them.
Yeah, they're very similar makeup teams. I think maybe just a little more experience on Virginia Tech, just from a coaching staff point of view. Obviously, Neil Brown's still kind of, and Justin Fuente's been there. Granted, he was on the hot seat, could still be depending on how the season ends. But you talked about cornerback play. Virginia Tech is proven to have a strong secondary. I mean, Jermaine Waller is one of the best corners in the country. If you look at, Pro Football Focus, and honestly, you put the tape out there, the guy locks down the side of the field. How important is it for Jarret Doege to be smart against a really good secondary that has, pretty good defensive backs? I know you touched on it as you gave your overall keys, but this is a really good secondary that gave Sam Howell. I mean, be frank, I know it could be bad North Carolina, but Sam Howell's worst game was against this Virginia Tech defense, and that's no slouch.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that had to do with their pressure up front too. I mean, they if that happens to Jarret Doege, it's going to be a long day for West Virginia. That's why I said they have to prevent that. And when there is pressure, they got to make good decisions. But to their secondary speak, I think that really the one advantage that West Virginia has, if you want to say that, there's not really an alpha wide receiver. They have a deep wide receiver room with a lot of guys, so they'll spread the football around. I can see them, trying to avoid certain cornerbacks, certain players. So I think really for me, I understand. Yeah, I've talked to several people this week from the Virginia Tech side as well, and they've mentioned the secondary. I think it starts up front. I know they're it's a band, it's a symphony. They play in unison. You got to have a good pass rush, and you got to be good on the back end. But I think it starts and finishes in this game up front. I really do. I think if they're able to throw Doege off rhythm, force him into some mistakes, which he's been prone to do at times, When you knock him off his spot, he maybe a perfect example was against Maryland. Had to scramble out to the right, threw off his back foot, and threw it right to a Maryland defender. And that was probably, I would argue, that the play that changed the game. So if Virginia Tech's able to disrupt him like that, I think it's going to be really hard for this West Virginia offense. But if he can make the right decisions, get the ball out, and avoid some of this pressure that I know Virginia Tech's going to bring, it makes things more interesting for both sides.
What do you want to see from the Mountaineer defense against an offense that has proven, granted, haven't put the points up necessarily, but has proven to move the ball down the field at least again? And this is, the last time West Virginia played a comparable opponent to this, they gave up 500 yards, which is never a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, well, West Virginia's defense last year was the fourth best unit in the country. Against Maryland, they hit them with some tempo that they weren't expecting. So when you look at that first quarter of that Maryland game, and you can't do it. I mean, it's all cumulative, but West Virginia's defense from the first quarter on is entirely different than the one that they played in the first quarter. It was bust. It looked bad. Maryland had them on their heels. Once they settled in, they played pretty well. I think that's something, if you watch the game, you'll see. In the third quarter, I think Maryland had something like 32 yards. So they played a lot better. They settled in. Obviously, they held Long Island to under 100 yards last week, but, Long Island, a Division II team, trying to transition to FCS, that's never a good thing. It's Power 5. But the thing I'm interested in seeing, though, from West Virginia's perspective, is they've got to communicate better, because that was a big reason they gave up some of those busts against Maryland. They weren't tested last week, so it's impossible to say, but they got to communicate better, play better team defense, and especially tackle. This is a game where they're going to have to tackle guys, especially if Burmeister's able to scramble or get out on some of their design runs. I know that they do a lot of design stuff for him. So they've got to be able to tackle and get him to the ground. And then also, once those running backs get downhill, they got to be able to plug that and stop them from creating some damage, because I know they can tempo as well. So it'll be interesting to see, how that all kind of comes together.
And then from the offense, you touched on it. You think if just Daggy comes in and has, a solid performance. I ironically saw one of his first starts against Kansas State when I was in Kansas for a year. So to date myself a little bit, but you think if he comes in and I don't want to say kind of a game manager kind of role, but, it throws for 150 yards or 200 yards, 2 touchdowns and not a touchdown. Do you think that, and the running game is supposed to be what the running game is supposed to be? Do you think that gives, West Virginia its best chance to win?
I think ideally they want him to throw the football, not necessarily a game manager, that they've got routes. I mean, he's done it against Oklahoma. I mean, other teams, like he's played well at times, but I feel like when you're able to get pressure on him, and I don't just feel this way, he does as well, and so do the coaches, he struggles. And I think that at times he looks really good. At times he doesn't. And I hate to put it all on one person, because the offensive line is just as big of a concern. But if you had to circle one thing that West Virginia, faithful, I wouldn't say the coaches, because they're going to look at everything, but, just kind of a novice look at West Virginia, that would be it. How is Jarrett Dagey going to handle this game? Is he going to be the guy, that led West Virginia to a win against Kansas State on the road, or led West Virginia to beat TCU, or is he going to be that guy that played against Maryland or got pulled at halftime against Army? And there's two very, very different guys there. I mean, it doesn't even look like the same player. So it'll be interesting to see how he kind of handles that, and really what Virginia Tech does to kind of throw them off for them. I think that's where the run game comes into play for West Virginia. You don't want to come out and just, go empty or play 10 personnel the whole time. You got to be able to try to run the football some.
Well, Keenan, let's jump right into prediction time. If you want to give one, 2.5 is the spread. West Virginia, the favorite here. 50.5 is the over/under. Do you think points are going to be scored? And do you think West Virginia is able to finally get back the Black Diamond Trophy for the first time since I was before I entered elementary school?
Points are close. I think it'll be like a 24-27 or 24-21 type of game. I'm gonna take the under just to take the under. I don't see this. The only way I see this game getting nuts on either side is if just one team allows that to happen. Special teams, turnovers, that kind of deal. If this game's played pretty clean, I think it's going to be really close. It comes down to, as I mentioned, what Jared Dagey shows up, if West Virginia can run the football, and if they can keep Virginia Tech in check on the run game. I think this is a big, big game for West Virginia. I say that because, you're in year 3 of Neil Brown's tenure. West Virginia doesn't get a lot of crack, at these traditional rivals, and it means a lot to the fan base. They have to play Oklahoma next week, by the way, on the road at Oklahoma. The difference between 1 and 3 and 2 and 2, or 2 and 1, 1 and 2 and 2 and 1. Sorry, math not my strong suit. It's why I'm a journalist. The difference between that is quite different in the perspective of fans. I think that West Virginia plays a more clean game. I think Virginia Tech's a good football team. How much do we know about them? I don't really know. I watched their first game, and I watched part of the last game. I think they kind of did what they did. I'm not sure on North Carolina right now myself. I think Sam Howell's very good. I think what around him, I question. I think this is going to be a close game. I picked West Virginia in other spots, so I'll be consistent. Would it surprise me if Virginia Tech won a close game? Not at all. But I do think anytime you look at games like this and everybody goes, man, that spread, Vegas tends to know something.
That is true. But I will disagree with you. I think Tech gets it done. I trust their offensive line just more in this one. If you want to say the defensive lines are kind of washed with the talent level there, I will disagree with you. But that also maybe my degree that I got from my Virginia Tech is coming out here a little bit here. But Keenan, thank you so much for joining me for this. How can our listeners, if Hokie fans, and heck, if Liberty or UVA play them in a bowl game later this year, you never know what happens. How can our listeners get more content from you and all folks? Rivals.com, WestVirginiaSports.com as well, or WVSports.com, I should say.
Yeah, you can head over to WVSports.com if you want to shoot me a follow on Twitter at RivalsKeenan. I cover West Virginia, but I've done a lot of stuff on Virginia Tech this week as well, looking at recruiting battles between the two coming together. We have a feature going to actually run tomorrow on the 2003 game and the craziness that happened with that. So a lot of fun stuff. It should be a great time. I expect an absolutely incredible atmosphere Saturday, and really some big-time football, because I know both these schools are, obviously played in the ACC. Sometimes the atmospheres aren't as great, and West Virginia's fans can't travel as much, to some of the plains of the Big 12. So it's going to be very interesting. It should be an old classic Big East football game. Let's go ahead and go with that.
Big East, a conference that doesn't exist in football anymore. Thank you so much for joining me for this special edition of Fastlane. As always, you can connect with me at TreyLyleVT, as well as at Fastlane Edlane, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We'd love to hear your feedback about this and your thoughts on this game, as well as all the games in the area. Thank you so much for listening to this special edition of the Fastlane.